There are quite a lot of places in the Elizabethan period when you could have come across a portrait of Elizabeth I. One of the first places you might find a portrait, if you were lucky enough to have coins in your purse, you would likely have, if you like, a portrait of Elizabeth in your pocket, because there were lots of new coins that were circulated from the early 1560s with a profile portrait of the Queen, and some of those were taken directly from the life. So people would have seen Elizabeth in many different places. She'd probably be the most familiar monarch of the Tudors, partly because portraiture was really so popular, becoming very popular in this period. There were also quite large numbers of painted and printed portraits that circulated, far more than are present with us today. What survived is really a very small percentage of portraits of Elizabeth I, and they've just deteriorated and been destroyed over time. But the number that exist show us that there were really portraits of Elizabeth that would be not just in houses of the nobility and the gentry, but also among the citizenry as well. You could certainly buy a portrait of Elizabeth I ready-made. And in this exhibition we've got both portraits, printed portraits, portraits on coinage, and painted portraits of the sort that will probably be in more ordinary people's houses. The kind of places that portraits would have hung are really quite varied in the 16th century. Well, there's a big demand really for portraits of Elizabeth I, and they would have hung in places like guild halls and livery halls and universities, but also of course in houses of the rich and the nobility and the gentry. But we know from 16th century inventories that they were owned as well by the citizenry, and there are clergymen who own portraits of Elizabeth and merchants of all different sorts that would be keen to display a portrait of the Queen. We know that Elizabeth I only really sat for artists on a handful of occasions, and how we reconcile the really large numbers of portraits of Elizabeth that existed in the Elizabethan period is a complicated question, because we know that artists must have taken templates or patterns that then circulated between different studios. So large numbers of artist studios could create portraits of Elizabeth to fill quite a lively demand, I think. The way that they would have done that is by taking a likeness directly of the Queen, and we've got one example behind of a 1575 portrait of Elizabeth, which is known as the Darnley portrait. What they would have done is create a face pattern, if you like, and then this would have been reversed and used again and again and again on different portraits of the Queen. Probably we're looking at 10 to 15 years, and I think there's something quite interesting about that, because here she is shown aged 40 or so. She manages to keep the same facial features for a good period of 15 to 20 years, which I think is something we'd all like to do.